The landing craft stopped hundreds of yards from the beach. Their ramps could drop, but there was no shore beneath them, only a shallow lagoon, a jagged coral reef, and a long stretch of water already being swept by Japanese fire. The Marines inside had expected to ride directly onto Betio. Instead, they faced a brutal choice: remain trapped beyond the reef or climb into chest-deep water and walk toward an island that was still firing back. Behind them waited the largest American invasion fleet yet assembled for an amphibious landing. Ahead stood less than 300 acres of sand, coral, concrete, and concealed weapons. On the morning of November 20th, 1943, the advance across the Central Pacific had reached Tarawa, and before the first day was over, the ocean itself would tear the American plan apart. Betio was a narrow island at the southwestern edge of Tarawa Atoll in the Gilbert Islands. It measured roughly 2.5 miles from end to end, and nowhere rose much more than 10 feet above the sea. On a map, it looked too small to stop a major military force. Strategically, however, it occupied an important position along the outer edge of Japan's defenses in the Central Pacific. Its airfield could help protect the approaches to the Marshall Islands, while its capture would give the United States another step toward the Marianas and eventually Japan itself. Operation Galvanic was therefore designed to seize positions in the Gilberts, including Makin and Tarawa, opening a new American route across the Pacific. The Japanese understood Betio's importance. Under Rear Admiral Keiji Shibasaki, thousands of Japanese naval troops and Korean laborers transformed the island into a compact fortress. Concrete bunkers, coconut log fighting positions, anti-tank ditches, barbed wire, mines, artillery, machine guns, and obstacles covered the shoreline and the ground behind it. The island's limited size allowed many positions to support one another. A Marine who escaped one field of fire could quickly enter another. Shibasaki reportedly told his men that 1 million Americans could not take Tarawa in 100 years. The statement was boastful, but the confidence behind it was not irrational. Betio was among the most heavily defended atolls Allied forces would assault during the Pacific War. The American force gathering against it was immense. Vice Admiral Raymond Spruance commanded the Fifth Fleet, while Rear Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner directed the amphibious forces. Major General Julian Smith's reinforced 2nd Marine Division would provide the assault troops at Tarawa. Battleships, carriers, cruisers, destroyers, transports, aircraft, and landing craft surrounded the objective. For several days, American aircraft attacked Japanese positions. On the morning of the invasion, battleships and other warships opened a tremendous bombardment. Shells struck the island, explosions threw coral and smoke into the air, and carrier aircraft swept over the target. From offshore, Betio appeared to be disappearing beneath the bombardment. The spectacle created a dangerous impression. Some observers believed that few defenders could have survived, but many Japanese positions had been designed precisely to endure such an attack. Concrete, sand, coral, and coconut logs absorbed or deflected much of the damage. Some guns were destroyed and communications were disrupted, but numerous bunkers remained intact. Worse, delays in the approach forced the landing schedule to change, and the supporting fire could not remain perfectly continuous as the first assault waves closed on the beach. Inside the smoke, Japanese soldiers emerged from protected positions, returned to their weapons, and waited. At 9:14 in the morning, the first assault waves reached Betio's northern shore. They traveled in tracked amphibious vehicles known as LVTs, or alligators. Unlike ordinary landing craft, the LVTs could climb over the coral reef and continue toward the beach. Japanese fire struck the vehicles as they approached, but within minutes they delivered more than 1,500 Marines onto the island. For a brief moment, the plan appeared to be working. The first men were ashore, small footholds were forming, and more waves were following across the lagoon. But the success depended on maintaining momentum. Most of the later troops were riding in Higgins boats, which needed several feet of water to clear the reef. American planners knew that a neap tide might leave the lagoon dangerously shallow, but available information could not guarantee the depth required by the landing craft. A local warning had emphasized the risk. Now that risk became reality. The expected water did not rise. One Higgins boat after another grounded on the reef, still hundreds of yards from Betio. The Marines climbed out. Carrying rifles, ammunition, radios, and other equipment, they began moving through the water toward the seawall. They had little cover and almost no freedom to maneuver. Japanese machine guns, mortars, and artillery fired across the lagoon. Men disappeared into shell holes hidden beneath the cloudy water. Units lost officers, radios, and equipment before reaching land. Some groups drifted away from their assigned beaches. Others reached the shore with their organization shattered. On portions of the landing area, individual companies suffered catastrophic losses during the approach. The reef had become both a barrier and a firing line. The Marines already ashore could not wait for the plan to recover. On Red Beach 2, near the long pier extending into the lagoon, Colonel David Shoup struggled toward the island, through the same fire, confronting his men. Shoup had been wounded, communications were failing, and reports from the beaches were incomplete or contradictory. Some commanders remained offshore. Units from different battalions had become mixed together. Radios had been lost or soaked, while the flagship's communications were repeatedly disrupted. No headquarters possessed a complete picture of the battle. Shoup nevertheless established a command post near the beach and assumed control of the troops he could reach. The original organization mattered less than the immediate problem: hold the narrow foothold, move weapons forward, and prevent the Japanese from driving the survivors back into the lagoon. Small groups began attacking fortified positions independently. Officers and enlisted Marines gathered whoever was nearby, crossed the seawall, and pushed inland a few yards at a time. Progress was measured not in miles, but in bunkers, trenches, and strips of sand. Along the pier, First Lieutenant William Hawkins and his scout sniper platoon attacked Japanese positions that threatened the landing area. Elsewhere, Marines crawled toward firing ports with grenades and explosive charges. Engineers and infantrymen began developing a method that would become brutally familiar. One man covered a position, another moved close enough to blind or burn it, and a third placed explosives to destroy it. Every bunker demanded another exposed advance. Every few yards revealed another concealed weapon. The tanks were supposed to provide the power needed to break this defensive system, but they too encountered the reef, underwater craters, and Japanese guns. Several Shermans were lost before reaching usable ground. Others arrived without proper coordination with the infantry and were sent forward against targets they could not clearly identify. By the end of the first day, only a small number remained operational. Those that survived, however, became mobile strongpoints. Their armor and 75mm guns gave isolated Marines a weapon capable of striking positions that rifles alone could not overcome. By sunset, the invasion had not failed, but it remained dangerously close to disaster. The Americans held scattered sections of shoreline and several shallow penetrations inland. In some places, the beachhead extended only a few dozen yards. Men from different formations occupied the same positions. Ammunition, water, medical supplies, and communications equipment were distributed unevenly. Wounded Marines crowded the limited shelter near the seawall. Offshore reinforcements and vital equipment still struggled to reach the island. The most dangerous moment had arrived. Japanese doctrine emphasized aggressive counterattacks, and a coordinated assault during the night could have struck the disorganized beachhead before the Marines consolidated their positions. Shoup and the commanders around him pulled men into defensible groups and prepared for an attack from the darkness. Yet the blow they feared never came in full strength. The bombardment had damaged Japanese communications, while the garrison's command structure was beginning to collapse. Admiral Shibasaki and members of his staff were killed during the fighting, reportedly by naval gunfire as they moved from their headquarters. Japanese resistance remained fierce, but increasingly it was fought by isolated groups rather than directed as a single coordinated defense. When daylight returned on November 21st, Betio was still alive with Japanese fire. Some defenders had swum into the lagoon during the night and occupied wrecked vehicles and a grounded ship, firing at the backs of Marines near the beaches. Fresh American troops attempting to land encountered the same deadly approaches. But the situation was beginning to change. Pack howitzers came ashore. Supplies moved along the pier and across the beach. Surviving LVTs carried ammunition and water inland, then returned with wounded men. The western end of Betio offered the next opportunity. Marines who had landed near Green Beach consolidated their position and, with tank support, attacked Japanese defenses there. Securing that beach created a more practical entry point for reinforcements. Destroyers inside the lagoon also delivered remarkably close fire support, striking strongpoints only a short distance ahead of American positions. These attacks were dangerous, but they gave the Marines the concentrated firepower they had lacked during the first hours. Across the island, small units pushed over the airfield and toward the southern shore. Japanese machine guns swept the open runway, isolating Marines who crossed it, but the penetration divided parts of the defensive system. Other troops linked the western foothold with positions on the northern beaches. The separate fragments of the invasion were slowly becoming a connected front. Shoup had now been working under fire for more than 50 hours. His men were exhausted, his casualty reports remained incomplete, and resistance ahead was still severe. Yet he could sense that the battle was turning. In a situation report that became one of the defining statements of Tarawa, he wrote, "Casualties, many. Percentage dead, unknown. Combat efficiency, we are winning." It was not empty confidence. By the afternoon of the second day, the Japanese had failed to eliminate the beachhead. American artillery was operating on Betio, more supplies were arriving, naval gunfire remained available, and the 6th Marines were entering the battle. The defenders, meanwhile, were increasingly exhausted, thirsty, and disconnected from one another. Their bunkers remained dangerous, but the larger defensive system had begun to break apart. On November the 22nd, the Americans pressed eastward from Green Beach and from the original landing areas. The attack now combined infantry, engineers, tanks, pack howitzers, naval guns, and aircraft with increasing efficiency. Flamethrowers and explosives were used against positions that refused to surrender. Bulldozers pushed coral and debris against firing apertures or buried defenders inside fortifications. The methods were grim, but frontal rifle attacks against prepared bunkers had already proved impossibly costly. The Americans connected more of their positions and gained control of most of the island. Japanese forces were compressed into isolated pockets, particularly toward Betio's eastern end. Their courage remained unquestioned, but courage could no longer replace communications, fresh water, ammunition, or coordinated command. A final Japanese message reported that the garrison's weapons had been destroyed and that the remaining men were preparing for a last charge. That night, the threat feared since the first landing finally emerged with greater force. Japanese troops launched a series of counterattacks against the Marines. The fighting came at close range, but the American line was no longer the fragile collection of survivors that had clung to the seawall on the first evening. Artillery, naval gunfire, automatic weapons, and prepared defensive fires struck the attackers. Destroyers offshore fired against assembly areas and supported the Marines through the darkness. By dawn, the final organized Japanese counterattacks had been broken. The last American advance began on the morning of November the 23rd. Aircraft and naval guns struck the remaining positions at the eastern end of Betio. Marine artillery joined the preparation, and infantry moved forward behind light and medium tanks. The remaining bunkers were cleared one after another. At approximately 1:30 in the afternoon, Major General Julian Smith declared Betio secured. The island that was said to be unconquerable for 100 years had fallen in 76 hours. Victory did not make the cost easier to comprehend. More than 1,000 American Marines and sailors were dead or missing and presumed dead, and more than 2,000 had been wounded. Of the thousands of Japanese troops and Korean laborers on Betio, only a small number survived to become prisoners. The fighting had been compressed onto an island so small that the scale of the losses shocked correspondents, commanders, and the American public. Images of the beach revealed wrecked landing vehicles, shattered defenses, and bodies along the water that had blocked the assault. Tarawa immediately became controversial. Americans asked whether such a small island had been worth so many lives. Military leaders could not ignore the failures exposed there: inadequate knowledge of the reef and tides, insufficient preliminary bombardment, fragile communications, too few amphibious tractors, confused logistics, and poor early coordination between tanks and infantry. But Tarawa also demonstrated that American amphibious doctrine was fundamentally capable of breaking even a heavily fortified island if its weaknesses were identified and corrected. The corrections began quickly. More LVTs were assigned to later invasions, many with improved armor and weapons. Naval bombardments became longer and more carefully coordinated. Hydrographic reconnaissance received greater attention. Underwater demolition teams were developed to survey approaches and remove obstacles before landings. Tank crews, infantrymen, engineers, artillery, aircraft, and naval gunfire trained to operate as integrated teams. When American forces attacked Kwajalein in the Marshall Islands only months later, they carried Tarawa's lessons with them. Betio, therefore, became more than a captured airfield. It was the place where the American advance across the Central Pacific learned what a defended reef could do to an invasion and what preparation would be required to cross the next one. Those lessons would shape the campaigns through the Marshalls, the Marianas, and beyond. The cost of Tarawa also outlived the war. Many of the Americans killed there were buried in hurried battlefield cemeteries. Records were incomplete, grave markers were moved, and some burial locations disappeared. Decades later, recovery teams continued searching Betio. Marines and sailors missing since 1943 have been identified and returned to their families long after the guns fell silent. The tide that failed at Tarawa nearly stopped the invasion at the reef. It left men exposed in the lagoon and turned a carefully prepared assault into a struggle for survival. But the Marines who crossed that water held their ground, rebuilt their shattered formations, and forced the battle forward. The victory opened the Central Pacific Drive, while its painful lessons helped later Americans reach other beaches with better weapons, better planning, and a greater chance of coming home. On that narrow strip of coral, the United States learned how costly the road across the Pacific would be and how it would have to fight to complete it.